During the summer of 1936, when Gerald Ford was 23 years old, he worked as a park ranger at Yellowstone National Park, making him the first person to be both a park ranger and President of the United States. I'm Bob Summers, and this is a presidential story. The history of national parks in the U.S. is older than the National Park Service itself. But the first great natural park was not a national park, but a state park. California's Yosemite State Park was established in 1864 after President Abraham Lincoln approved a donation of federal land to the state. The first true national park was Yellowstone, which was approved by President Ulysses S. Grant on March 1, 1872. Although Grant never visited the park, he often said that creating a national park was the best idea America ever had. Spanning the present-day states of Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana, Yellowstone National Park is named after the Yellowstone River, which runs through it. In the Yellowstone National Park Protection Act that Grant signed, it specified that the headwaters of the Yellowstone River is hereby reserved and withdrawn from settlement, occupancy, or sale, and dedicated and set apart as a public park or pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. At a time of frenzied westward expansion, the federal government for the first time had set aside land that would never be developed. Following the precedent set with Yellowstone, Congress started to establish additional national parks in the 1890s and early 1900s, including Mount Rainier National Park in 1899, Crater Lake National Park in 1902, Glacier National Park in 1910, and Yosemite National Park, which was returned to the United States in 1890. There was no greater presidential advocate for the great outdoors than Theodore Roosevelt. In 1903, President Roosevelt visited Yellowstone and laid the cornerstone for the arch, now called the Roosevelt Arch, at the north entrance just outside of Gardner, Montana. National parks were developed by conservationists and by hunters alike as a way to preserve nature and wildlife, but also by businessmen wanting to promote tourism. In 1883, President Chester Arthur cut the ceremonial ribbon to open the Northern Pacific Rail line that arrived at the northern boundary of the park. As more and more railroads reached the park, they also built grand hotels, so their train passengers had places to stay at the park's headquarters in Mammoth Hot Springs. President Arthur and his large entourage vacationed in the Yellowstone area for the next 2 months. President Roosevelt wanted to preserve the natural wealth of the United States for the public instead of leaving it for the economic benefit of entrepreneurs. In a move to preserve Native American prehistoric ruins and artifacts, Roosevelt signed the Antiquities Act of 1906. Through presidential proclamation under the authority of the Antiquities Act, Roosevelt created cultural and natural areas during his terms covering 150 million acres. With so many more parks, business promoters campaigned for a National Parks Bureau in the pages of the Saturday Evening Post and National Geographic. The successful campaign led to the signing of the Organic Act by President Woodrow Wilson in 1916, which established the National Park Service as a federal bureau within the Department of the Interior. Before that time, it was the U.S. Army that was placed in charge of the park system. Those soldiers finally left Yellowstone in 1918. After Teddy Roosevelt's visit in Yellowstone in 1903, no president visited Yellowstone Park for the next 20 years. In 1923, as President Warren Harding was traveling on his ill-fated West Coast trip, he stopped at Yellowstone. He visited Old Faithful, spent the night at the Old Faithful Inn, and fed the bears, which was great entertainment for the tourists at the time, but is no longer acceptable in the park today. As he left the park, Harding stopped to speak with reporters. According to Harding, commercialism will never be tolerated here as long as I have the power to prevent it. He died 1 month later. In the summer of 1936, 23-year-old Gerald Ford worked as a park ranger at Yellowstone. Among his duties were fighting forest fires, directing traffic, supervising campgrounds, and greeting the VIPs at the Canyon Hotel and Lodge, which Ford told his supervisors was undemocratic, since all visitors should be given the VIP treatment, or none at all. Ford also acted as an armed guard, protecting the other rangers on the bear feeding truck, a story he would retell to his family often. As mentioned earlier, the park no longer feeds the bears, but at the time this was a great treat for the park visitors, and probably for the bears as well. According to Ford's roommate that summer, Wayne Replogle, Ford particularly enjoyed the early morning check. Every morning between 5 and 7, each vehicle in the park had to be checked by make, model, state, and license plate. Replogle stated that the rangers would need to run in order to document the 150 to 200 vehicles in the 2-hour window allotted. The athletic former football player Ford saw this activity as his opportunity to stay fit. Ford loved everything about being a ranger, and later recalled that time as one of the greatest summers of my life. His supervisor, Canyon District Ranger Frank Anderson, called Ford a damn good ranger. During the 1976 presidential campaign, Ford once again visited Yellowstone, this time with his daughter Susan and son Jack, who would go on to become a Yellowstone Park Ranger himself. During the visit, Ford reconnected with Wayne Replogle, who had written books about Yellowstone. Ford spoke to the assembled crowd from Old Faithful. While discussing his experience as a park ranger and the treasures of Yellowstone, Old Faithful erupted to the delight of the crowd, and even Ford, who commented, "I always knew the Park Service was efficient and effective, and they really proved it just a moment ago." Ford continued his speech by pledging to introduce the Bicentennial Land Heritage Act, which would double the size and budget of the National Park Service over the next 10 years. The bill never made it out of committee. Ford closed his speech referring to his days at Yellowstone with gratitude and a view for the future. "I remember as a ranger the first time I stood alone on Inspiration Point over at Canyon Station, looking out over this beautiful land. I thought to myself how lucky I was that my parents' and grandparents' generation had the vision and the determination to save it for us. Now it is our turn to make our own gift outright to those who will come after us. 15 years, 40 years, 100 years from now, I want to be as faithful to my grandchildren's generation as Old Faithful has been to ours." Although he never used the powers of the Antiquities Act to create new parks while president, Ford did sign Congress's bills that created 18 new parks, including Valley Forge, Big Cypress National Preserve, and the Martin Van Buren National Historic Site. Today, the National Park Service manages 429 separate units covering more than 85 million acres in every U.S. state and territory, employs 20,000 permanent employees and 279,000 volunteers, and welcomes over 300 million visitors annually. Later in life, Ford participated in an oral history with staff of the National Park Service. Reflecting on his time as a park ranger, Ford shared that the experience of spending a summer in the gorgeous inspiration of Yellowstone Park was important. It's something I really treasure, and when I went back as president, it was a thrill, even though Canyon had changed considerably. It wasn't the same old rustic canyon that we saw in 1936. Thanks for watching.